Remembers that day, I suppose, in World War I when this whole thing started. But 100 years ago, President Wilson was running for his second term, and his main campaign was, "We will keep American boys out of Europe." 6 months later, we are in Europe. At the same time, 100 years ago, we were deep into Chihuahua province chasing a guy by the name of Pancho Villa. So that gives you an idea of the overall isolationist mood of this country prior to the declaration of war. Apparently in 6 months that changed dramatically, or did it? And we're going to find out from these folks is the attitude of Utahns in different localities as to what their attitude towards World War I was. I'm going to ask you please to not ask any questions until all three of them are done with the presentations. We'll have a Q&A at the end of it. The very first presentation, Kanarraville, Women Fight World War I, is by Kerry Bate. He is a retired director of the Housing Authority of Salt Lake County, and prior to that, he served as director of the Community Development Division, State of Utah. His current book, The Women, A Family Story, is being published by the University of Utah Press in the fall of 2016. The second presenter, Bob McPherson, professor of history at USU Blanding campus. And his subject is on the Native American reaction to World War I. Bob is a professor of history at Utah State University, Blanding campus, and is a Utah State Historical Society fellow. He specializes in research concerning the history and culture of the Four Corners region, and I should mention he's also author of many books. The third presenter, Allan Powell, is probably very familiar to everybody, fellow Utah State Historical Society, and World War I in Castle Valley, the impact of the war on Carbon and Emery counties. Kent has received his PhD in history at the University of Utah and retired in 2013 as senior historian at the Utah State Historical Society and managing editor of the Utah Historical Quarterly. He has edited 2 books on World War I, Nels Anderson's World War I Diary, and Utah and the Great War, the Beehive State, and the World War I Experience, both published by the University of Utah. So with that, then we'll just go right into these 3, and then we'll have Q&A at the end of it. So go right ahead. Here's the mic.
Thanks, Bob. Get older, my hands tremble a little bit, so it's nice to have a podium to put the paper on. I'd like to thank Camp for inviting me to do this presentation. He's somebody I've admired for many, many years, going back to when we both worked in the same department of state government. I did confess to Camp that I had given this paper 25 years ago at a State Historical Society meeting, and he said, "That's a long time ago." And I thought, yeah, but these are a bunch of historians. So we'll find out if you can bear with it again. My paper is about Kanarraville in World War I, and the most interesting source I couldn't locate were the records of the Relief Society of Kanarraville, because the women in the town played a very important role during the war. But I was able to make up for that with oral history interviews with the reports in the local newspaper. I discovered a couple of diaries that were relevant, also family letters and family histories. So I think I've been able to partly fill in what's missing. A letter written on January 3rd, 1915 from a woman named Mary Ann Campbell Wilson to her cousins, Elizabeth Stapley, who was a midwife in Kanarraville, anticipated a question. "I'm sure you're anxious to hear how we get along these war times. Well, we have much to be thankful for. We have food to eat, though much dearer than usual. And at any rate, we only eat to live, but some people live to eat. It would be harder on them than us. The government thinks we should send more men, and so do we all, so that this dreadful war might be brought to an end. Yet there has been talk about peace, but I am afraid it will not come yet." And then she wrote again in the middle of the next year, "We're praying to God that he may bring an end to this war. He could stop it in a moment if he would. Peace is beautiful. God grant us that we may have it soon again." And as Bob mentioned, Woodrow Wilson campaigned in 1916 on keeping America out of the war. And he was so successful in the state of Utah that there was a Democratic landslide that elected our first Jewish governor. Despite a Republican parody song that said, "Democracy's latest star, Utah, we love thee. Thy lucre shines afar, Utah, we love thee." Anti-Semitism never played very well in Utah. But even before Wilson's second inaugural, it became pretty obvious there were serious potential for war breaking out. The Germans began unrestricted submarine warfare, and they announced that in January 1917, and Elizabeth Stapley, the Kanarraville midwife, her cousin in Ireland was pretty happy when the war was declared. "I see America has joined the Allies. What have you to say to that? We're all pleased to have America help us to stay the giant. Never was such a war, and never was such a wicked leader. The Kaiser's name will go down to posterity with a black mark against it like the biblical kings. He feared not God nor man." And the local newspaper, the Iron County Record, was very jingoistic, and it was as enthused as Elizabeth's European cousin. It endorsed the Conscription Act in May 1917, but the people in Kanarraville were never very excited about this adventure, even at the height of the war fever. A note of caution was sounded by the Kanarraville correspondent to the newspaper in June 1917. "Registration day, June 5th, seems to worry some of the young men," the reporter wrote. "Also, some of the women don't feel any too good about it either. They feel that if the men could do their scrapping on their own land, it wouldn't be so bad." And then the record also carried the story of an eager Iron County volunteer named Gene Woodbury, who was turned down by the Army, the Navy, the National Guard, and even something called the Aviation Corps. "He's all broken up over it and practically discouraged with living," noted the newspaper. And significantly, though, in Kanarra, very few were eager to volunteer. Of the 16 men from Kanarra who served in World War I, only Emery Pollock was a volunteer. Nobody wanted their family to go, Arvilla Woodbury explained, but they were drafted and they had to go. They were afraid they'd get killed. The first 6 draftees were announced in the newspaper on August 24th, 1917, one of whom never served, probably because he had a wife and a child. A banquet was given the departing soldier boys the day before their entrainment at Lund, the Kanarraville correspondent reported in September. The old martial band was out in full force, and a rousing meeting was held in the afternoon. Fruit and melons were served to all present, followed by a dance. The boys all expressed their appreciation of the honor showed them. The drafting continued, and the community felt eventually quite hard-pressed to have so many men in service. When the first Liberty loan they were subscribing to the loan, they were very, very few subscriptions in Kanarra. Only 9 people subscribed to the second loan drive, and they only subscribed $800. But by the time the next loan drive came around, their sons were overseas and or being drafted, and the subscriptions went up to 47 counties. It was a town of 300 people. They subscribed $4,750. In addition, the school district subscribed $100, and draftee Leland Stapley's sister remembered of the townsfolk. They were patriotic. I've never seen more patriotic people than they were then. We bought war bonds, even the school, and I can remember I was only in the 5th grade. We went out and gleaned beans and sold them and bought a war bond. And later that war bond was cashed in to buy a Victrola for the school. The next Liberty Loan drive began in April 1918, and the newspaper was predicting that with the stirring events in Europe, it will not be hard to sustain subscriptions this time. And the Kanarra Records report, we had in attendance at our afternoon services last Sunday Uriah T. Jones and Emily C. Watson in the interest of the Third Liberty Loan. Kanarra, Iron County was supposed to come up with $94,000 out of Utah's $10 million allotment. Kanarraville was directed to come up with 5,000, which could be raised by April 8, which was supposed to be raised by April 18th. They haven't quite met that a week later. Now, not all of their draftees saw combat. The town sprinter, Jewett Wood, was drafted, but allegedly discharged for defective teeth. Townspeople suspected he really was let go because he had a certain mental vacancy. For instance, when a speed limit was posted in town of 35 miles per hour, he said worriedly, "I couldn't ever get the darn thing to get up that high." And maybe the idea he wasn't quite right was reinforced when the county newspaper reported that he had nothing but good words for the training camp and the military training he'd received. In the 1916 election, Kanarraville's Phoebe Davis voted for Woodrow Wilson, even though she was a staunch Republican because she didn't want her son Elmer to be drafted. After the war, she was very resentful. She lived to be 102, and she never voted for a Democrat again in her life. And meanwhile, Elmer was drafted and sent to Fort Lewis. The diary of the 91st Division bugler, Leland Stapley, was published in the Iron County Record, and he outlines some typical experiences during the war. He was sent to New York. He wrote, "People at every station gave us candy, cigarettes, and wished us good luck." From New York, he sailed on a ship named Dano to Halifax to join a 22-ship convoy to Europe. He wrote that life on board was one continual jam. We had daily inspections, which are the curse of a soldier's life. The trip across was one hard knock after another. The main excitement was the sighting of a whale now and then, and the rush for the canteen when it opened. He landed in France on July 22nd, 1918, and then he was shipped to Le Havre. We traveled on an English ship being fed on fish, which nearly made us all sick from the smell, he wrote. But after living on tea and dried fish in this rest camp for 2 days, we'd have welcomed the grub that was thrown through the porthole of the ship. And from there, he was shipped out in a box car, and he couldn't help but notice that the car said 8 men or 40 horses. When he finally got to his next destination, he said the first thing we did was to police up the town and taste some of the French wine. The next thing we did was to try and learn the French language, but we found it much easier for the French to learn ours. And by September 3rd, he was hiking in Bate. There, we got our first instructions on air bombing. One was not allowed to smoke after dark in the dusk. Smoke after dusk in the open, excuse me. But by September 21st, his life was getting pretty exciting. He wrote, "Another red letter day. We had our first taste of Fritz. One afternoon, we were all engaged in a little card game. We heard a whiz through the air that made us duck our heads and chilled our blood. The shell landed about 150 yards from our quarters, and it sounded like it was in the house." He found a real battle on September 26th, 3 p.m., 0 hour. It's impossible to describe the noise made by the cannon. Hundreds of them firing at the same time with huge shells bursting all around. The lights of Broadway, and he'd gone through New York on his way to Europe, are mere glimmers when compared with the lights of battle. The flashes of the guns, the star shell lights, the signal rockets lighted up the horizon in one continual stream of fire. Daybreak found us moving through the forest to Hess, and every tree and bush screamed lines of heavy guns. We traveled in trucks to the edge of no man's land. From there, we made our way on foot, carrying machine guns and equipment and rations in a light pack. In marching over no man's land, which had been in the hands of the Germans for 4 years, we had to cross one large shell hole after the other. We saw the effect of artillery fire. No farmer ever turned up the soil more thoroughly than the artillery plowed up the forest here. There was not one tree that was full of shrapnel. Kilo after kilo, it was one shell hole after another. Some of the sights along the road would make a strong man weak. We halted at sundown on the skirts of Berry to eat. Some of us didn't have time to eat. I had 3 boxes of AM, and with a slice of bacon hanging from my mouth, I made my way through Berry, which was being shelled heavily by the Hun guns. The march was the hardest part of the fight, for it looked like a death trap to me as all the men were falling. There were shells on all sides, but we marched right through. We spent our second night in the rain with only a raincoat. And then life got so hectic, his diary entries become very succinct. Dodging HEs and shrapnel and aerators. Then a Hun plane came down and dropped 2 large bombs. The first striking near us, and the last one came down on a group of engineers, killing 40 men and 14 horses. Such was the excitement of each day. Next day, 2 runners were killed. Then one's nerves sure go to pieces in time under shell fire. And then one can see now and then a skull of some brave warrior who'd been dug up by a highly explosive shell. Then 32 Bate prisoners killed. Had some sneezing gas, which is nothing very nice. One cannot keep his mask on when he gets in touch with that gas. And the diary ends abruptly on November 11th, and he concludes, "This is only part of what happened, yet it'll do you till I get home." And he lists the boys from Iron County who were overseas with him. Probably the soldier who had the most adventure in World War I was Leon Davis, or in the pronunciation of Kanarraville, Leon Davis. He found it hard to leave home. The mail was undependable. He complained, and he had a diary too. I don't know if I mentioned that, but he claimed that cooks had big sores on him, and he was convinced he had the meanest sergeant that ever lived. His diaries is wonderfully readable as Leland Stapley's, but it opens on June 23rd, 1919. And he was stationed with the expeditionary group in Russia. He wrote of a train ride. There was 1 million bed bugs to an inch in the train our squad stayed in. And the next day, with an 80 or 90 pound pack, he had to hike to a mountaintop, and he wrote that the Bolsheviks had blown up 3 power plants in about 10 miles, so we rode when we could and walked when we had to. The Bolsheviks had also burned out all the bridges along the way. He writes, "The Bolsheviks opened fire on us. We just moved and a big slug hit where I was standing just a second before. We shot 3 guys on the hill. By the time their corporal came back and turned around, we saw 3 Bolsheviks right behind us. We all shot and got them, and we thought there were more behind, so we retreated back to the bridge. There were 156 Bolsheviks killed and 2 Americans wounded." He disarmed two of the dead Russians, and he found they had 2 packs, 2 guns and ammunitions. One of the packs contained a can of powder, underclothes, a cup, bread, and a pocketbook that had about 41 rubles. And the other was about the same. And he ended the day with the complaint, "We had supper about 6 p.m., no dinner, and damn little breakfast." Well, these drafts and these loan drives enjoyed the support of the Mormon community, or the Mormon hierarchy. The bishop's counselor in Kanarraville, Joel Roundy, was an optimist and explained in church that he looked for good to come out of the war. And he argued later that the Mormon soldiers are preaching the gospel by example. Maybe he wasn't thinking of his nephew, Leland Stapley, sampling French wine and French cigarettes. Maybe he was thinking of his son Jesse, who was on a mission in the southern states and wanted to feel that he was contributing. His other son was contributing in the same way, who was drafted. There were also the pleasant side effects of the war, that some of Kanarraville's wildest young men suddenly got pretty serious about their eternal prospects. The church records record Sister Harriet Balzer told of Leo and Claude writing home and saying they believed the gospel and they wanted to book a Mormon. And Wells Williams got a headline in the local newspaper, "Wells Williams sees great religious awakening." He commented, they printed a letter he wrote to his brother RJ, and he wrote, "You know, I believe that I'm a better boy since coming to training. At least I attend church more often, and now that I'm out here, I can see a greater need of taking a deeper interest in the study of Mormonism. And there's no question but that Mormon boys are gaining distinction here in camp." And he went on to become the town's bishop. And the national press reports of Utah's enthusiasm for the war seemed to have a positive effect elsewhere. Kanarraville's William Grant Platt was on a Southern States mission. He was in Alabama, and he wrote of Utah's oversubscribing to the Liberty loan drives and their enthusiastic patriotism, that his his missionary job was much easier. Even James Lorenzo Roundy, who was also in the Southern State Mission, a very gentle-natured person, he was so bashful he didn't get married till he was 72. He used military metaphors as he spoke of putting on the whole armor of God, taking the shield of faith, the helmet of salvation, and the sword of the Spirit. If military-aged men were the biggest contribution Kanarraville can make to the front lines, it was really the efforts of the townswomen who were the most significant to the home contribution. The Rocky Mountain Division of the Red Cross organized chapters throughout the state, and each chapter was very busy doing Red Cross work. The Kanarraville Relief Society twice did presentations in church with church meetings devoted to talking about Red Cross work, the life of Clara Barton, and the work the women needed to do. When the current president had first attended Relief Society minutes, the older women talked about life in Nauvoo. But this younger woman organized more up-to-date things, and many of you know that, for instance, the efforts to get sanitized water, health improvements came from the women of the Relief Society who were tired of their children dying from diphtheria and other diseases. So they used the Relief Society Hall as the place to do Red Cross work. It was a large building, it was well heated, and it was so solidly built that on the 24th of July, when people got drunk celebrating, they were locked up in the Relief Society Hall until the Dixie wine had worn off. And I'm getting close to running out of time, so get Kent's book and you can see the whole story. But they spent an enormous amount of time making crutch pads, washcloths, ambulance pillows, comfort pillows, pillowcases, socks, sweaters, pajamas, sweatshirts, bandages, napkins, tray cloths, ice trays, and hot water bottle covers. And the women of Kanarra did all those things, and I'll conclude with just telling you what they did in March 1918. This is just 1 month. At the first of the month, they contributed 10 pajama suits. They were hard at work on socks, napkins, and handkerchiefs. By the middle of the month, they completed 40 napkins, 32 ice bags, 28 tray cloths, 11 pairs of bed socks, 9 handkerchiefs, and 12 washcloths. At the same time, the Dramatic Club staged a fundraising minstrel show called In Dixie to a packed house on a night of drenching rain. They were planning another play, and at the end of the month, they contributed an additional 10 suits of pajamas, 4 sweaters, and many more socks. They were even instructed to contribute to the war effort by saving candy and gum wrappings made of tinfoil and worth 60 cents a pound. And with that, I'll conclude, and thank you so much.
Should I sing or just talk?
I prefer you talk. I've heard you sing.
Well, it's good to be here, and Kent has asked me to provide a little bit of an overview concerning Native American response to World War I. And so what I'm going to do is, and we aren't going to go across the seas, we aren't going to have the experiences we just heard about. We're going to stay here in the States, and I'm going to look at 3 different groups. I'm going to stretch southeastern Utah a little bit to the east, and I'm going to include southwestern Colorado, where you have the Ute peoples there are 2 tribal areas headquartered in Ignacio and in Toyac. And the reason I'm including them is because their response is very, very different from the Utes/Paiutes living in southeastern Utah and how they approach this thing. And then we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at the Navajo response, which is very, very different from the other 2 groups. If we're looking at those that are most in tune with the way the dominant society worked, we're going to start with those folks. We're going to start with the Southern Utes. And then we're going to start moving down. By the time we get to the Navajo, the interpretation, the cultural interpretation of things that are going on is really the story. Okay, so we'll go ahead and we'll start with the Southern Utes. And it might be surprising that to you that for Native Americans, they all needed to register, but they weren't necessarily going to be drafted. But everybody had to register. So the draft started out between ages 21 and 31, you had to register. And then later on, of course, that was expanded a little bit later to 18 to 45. The day of registration for the Southern Utes was going to take place in Durango. There are 25 men who were eligible to register. Again, we're not talking about the draft, but were eligible to register. That day, there was a bear dance going on, there were other activities going on, and only a half a dozen people signed up. But once the word got out, all 25 men registered for the draft. And there was this initial enthusiasm, this desire to be involved and do what we can to help this cause. In fact, it got to the point where eventually the tribe, the Southern Ute tribe, authorized or offered, let me put it that way, offered their tribal budget to go towards helping to win the war. In other words, their bank account, maybe I shouldn't say budget, but their bank account. And so they offered to have this go in to help defeat the enemy. Now, that's interesting. You have everybody registered that can be registered. You've got this wonderful gesture and so forth. But things kind of shift. And in April, in August rather, the paper started reporting there was real opposition to being involved in the war. And the reason that the papers said, and of course this is very, very typical of what you find during World War I, is that probably German operatives were in the community and talking to the Utes about their history and the way things had rolled out for them in the past, and that they really shouldn't respond favorably and so forth. So there's this feeling that, oh my gosh, we've got operatives here that are working against us, and they're turning the Indian peoples against us. It got to the point actually where the people said, were told that if you didn't, we could call in the soldiers. Now, we're all familiar with the time we're looking at, 1917. And we could call in the soldiers. And the Utes' response to that was, okay, we'd rather fight at home than we would across the ocean. So, if that's the way it's going to be, we know our land. We're going to be here for that. That happens. It never got to that. But I'd like to read a statement from Buckskin Charlie, who is a Southern Ute, and he kind of summarizes it from their perspective and trying to call upon history to explain why the Ute people felt the way that they did and why they resisted. So here's Buckskin Charlie summarizes it this way. He said, "We buried our arrows and tomahawks and guns, and we have never dug them up. We spread a white sheet over them to cover the black things that we have done. Now the government asks us to dig these up and to fight again. We do not want to go back to the old ways. We do not want our young men to register or be taken away. Congress and the government who made this war did not ask the Indians about it. We feel like a man who has had a long sleep and who has awakened and been told things that are going on at the present time and things that will be going on in the future. I have heard that you have made out a paper with all of the young men's names from 18 to 45. I want you to rub those names off that paper. I do not want any of these Utes to register." Well, it never got to that point. The armistice would eventually be signed, and things just kind of went back to normal. I mention this because their response is very much in keeping with things that kind of fit in with the dominant culture. Even Buckskin Charlie's explanation is something that people could understand. It represents, I guess you'd say, the more more acculturated view at the time of Native Americans. So I offer that as one end of the spectrum. We're now going to go into southeastern Utah, where we belong, and we're going to talk about the Utes and the Paiutes. The Utes and the Paiutes have a history of confrontation. In fact, I don't know if this is accurate, but it is often said, I believe it is accurate, but the last Indian war was fought in San Juan County. I don't know if that's really the case. It was a war. It's more a rebellion of the whites against the existing conditions of the Native Americans, and it wasn't really a war as we would think of it. But certainly in 1923, when the Posey incident ended, that ended the armed conflict that had been going on, low-grade fever, for a long, long time down there. So we've got a couple of people that become kind of the lightning rods, Polk and Posey. And everybody talks about them. They're kind of the Darth Vaders of that area, and everybody expects them to get into trouble. And they often were not disappointed. You know, things they had their way of keeping the pot boiling. The newspapers at the time, though, say some interesting things about how this group that has been characterized historically as constantly being involved in confrontation and so forth is pictured in the paper. So let me just share a couple of quotes here. It says, they, speaking of the Utes, and Utes and Paiutes, when I use the word Utes, I'm including this group that historically, for over 100 years, has been characterized as Utes and Paiutes and so forth, and has their own reputation. They, the Utes, inquire eagerly about the number of boys who have gone or are soon to go into military training, as if each departure had brought us nearer their numerical level. And at this time, Blanding had 118 families, 23 men had left from Blanding. So what you've got here is, because there's been this local friction going on, the Utes are very happy to see these soldiers, these young men that are going over seas to fight. Another quote, more fresh and ugly than they had been since 1915 fight, and there was a gunfight that took place down in Bluff where men were killed on both sides. They also nurse a special dislike for the draft regulations. Another quote, noted Indian prepares for war, old Posey storing up guns and ammunition, the Utes program of preparedness to oppose Uncle Sam. And it was reported that supposedly these Utes were going to get with the Navajo people and some of the other Utes and some Mexicans, and they were going to take over San Juan County. So that's the that's the other group of our Ute factions here that we want to look at. But I think really the most interesting one for me is the Navajo understanding of what was going on. I think it's fair to say that we all end up learning new things by attaching them to older things that we are familiar with. And this attachment is part of what you see going on here with the Navajo perspective. From an economic standpoint, the war was a great boon for the Navajo people. Just to give you some ideas, wool, mutton, lambs, cattle, the livestock industry that the Navajo people were involved in just took off because of the war. Starting in 1914, the price of wool, for instance, went from 11 cents, jumped up to 58 cents a pound. Sheep, $3.91, jumped up to $11.76. And the same thing with lambs. So while this is going on, the Navajo people are cashing in on this. Now realize that they're living in a trading post era, and isolated trading posts throughout the reservation they are buying the wool and then shipping it. It goes all the way back east to Philadelphia and New York and so forth. You've got animals that, of course, are part of the food process to feed the army and so forth. The Navajos capitalized on this. In fact, it got to the point where the traders became very, very concerned, because what was happening is the Navajos were doing so well because of this. They were selling their sheep and so forth. By the end of the war, their herds had been reduced to 50% because it was so profitable. It was a good thing. But the traders are looking at this and saying, hey, you've got to be able to sustain your economy. You can't just sell everything because it's at a good price. So there is this shift. A lot of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Navajo blankets and weaving, and that, of course, was a very, very popular thing in the tourist trade. During the war, the whole weaving process greatly reduced because that wool was not going into blankets. The wool was going to make uniforms and so forth, and so that was part of it. People like Louisa Wetherill would represent the Red Cross and ride around, go from Hogan to Hogan and so forth, receiving donations that would go towards the war effort. So there are a lot of things that are happening here that are very positive. On the negative side, there are social impacts also. For instance, 2/3 of all the BIA doctors that were on the reservation got sucked up and went off to the war. And that was not a good thing because there weren't that many to begin with, but they're gone. Registration was so difficult because of everybody living in isolated places and so forth. It's estimated that probably only a dozen Navajo people actually ended up serving in World War I. Now, before you get the wrong impression here, compare that to World War II. 1945, it was estimated that over 10,000 Navajo people served in the war industries or as soldiers and so forth in the military. So it's not that there's not a lack of caring or patriotism, but it's just a matter of getting the word out. And you have to realize that the Navajo people at this time were the least acculturated in terms of Anglo-American values and things of all of these different groups that we're talking about. But they're still very much aware of the war. I interviewed a man one time named Charlie Blue Eyes. Charlie Blue Eyes. And Charlie said he remembers when he was at the Shiprock boarding school, just a young boy, dressed in a uniform of the boarding school, which is part of the requirements. And he said that they used to pretend that they were Germans, and they'd use wild spinach stems for guns. Here's a quote. He said, "People are always fighting." This is how he's thinking about it as a young man. "People are always fighting over land because of its riches. The Germans hold out their hands to reach for these minerals." This kind of metaphorical thinking is very, very typical of Navajo people. So he's pictures these holding out their hands to reach for these minerals. In our play, we would say, "I'll burn your hands off," or "shoot your hands off." Our school uniforms are right for playing army. We wore caps too. So there's Charlie, just a young boy, but that's how he translates things, in his using cultural metaphors that are part of his world. A lot of the trading posts would get involved in one way or another with supporting the war, but a lot of times it was just business. But there's a really fine account that's offered by a woman named Hildefonse Wetherill at Covered Water that talks a lot about how people viewed what was going on, how the Navajo people viewed. She talks about how every week the New York Times would come in to the trading post, and that area in there that's encased by the counters and so forth, called the bullpen. The Navajo people would go into the bullpen, and there'd be a big crowd, and they'd take the New York Times newspapers and they put it out on the counter, and they'd look at the pictures. Of course, they couldn't read, but they would look at the pictures, and they would try to figure out, what is this world like these white people are involved in. They'd look at these tall buildings, and they'd see a person by it, so then they'd figure, okay, this is how tall it is, and they start comparing it to rock formations that are around that they're familiar with, and say, okay, it's probably about as big as, and then you pick your rock formation. They tried to figure out how many people were involved in this thing, and you'd see there'd be pictures of like crowds of people, and they tried to figure out, okay, how many people are in this picture? So these guys are smart. They took a pop bottle and they take a pencil and they put it on the picture and they draw a circle around that, and then they count the people in the circle. And then they do that again, and they go through that whole picture, and then they figure, well, I think we probably missed about 4 or 5 people, so we'll add that to the number. And then they'd ask the trader, okay, now you add all this up and tell us how many people is it. And of course, we're talking about a crowd, and so it's very, very, a large number of people. So he'd come back with this number, and they try to figure out, whoa, okay, let's see now. let's talk about livestock. Oh, 3 minutes, okay. So they would try to compare it to the livestock and how many sheep this person had. They came up with the answer that there are so many white men that we can't count them. As close as we can get at this point is to just say that if you look at the stars in the sky, that's probably how many white people there are over there in this thing. One person looked at pictures of the battlefield, and there was this, we've all seen this tanglefoot, this barbed wire stuff to part of the trying to slow down the enemy. And he looked at that and said, those people really don't know how to build fences. And then he was wondering, I wonder if, after the war, do you think I could get that wire? Because I could really use it, and I could build a great fence with that. So, okay, all right. So, and then they look at airplanes, and they see these airplanes flying in formation. And you'd see these formations, and they say, well, that's kind of like ducks flying in formation. These must be like these. And I know that there's a man riding in it. I know there's someone in there, but still, they must act like ducks. Did they come down to the water holes? Is that how these planes work and everything? And it's just very, very interesting. One person said, and this is a little bit more serious. He says, how could they bury the dead when there were no quiet and out of the way places? One said, there must be much weeping. All the women will cry. So that's kind of the way it went. There were some people who, as the registration for the draft got started, and this was handled in the Trading Post, there was real concern, and it got to the point where they're thinking they're going to take us and they're going to put us in the front line so the white guys don't get killed. And there was an all-day conference, and I'm just telescoping this down. There was an all-day conference at the Trading Post that went into the night. And finally, the trader, Ken, said, okay, this is what's going to happen. Who we're really fighting are the Mexicans. Historically, that rang some real notes. The ammunition, all of it, sold out. Everybody had their guns. They were ready to fight the Mexicans. And he said, and I'll lead you. I'll go with you when it happens. Well, the armistice was signed, and it never happened. But there were some tense moments, and there was some real concern about how that whole thing would roll out. There are other things, but we'll go ahead and my time is up. I would just like to close by saying, we look at these things now and we say, whoa, that's kind of strange. It's kind of strange. But it's not at all. It's not at all. It's just like us when we're introduced to something new and we don't understand how it works or what's involved with it, and we say, we tie it to things that we're interested in, that we understand, that we've experienced. And that's what you've got here. I'll close by just saying that many of these people sacrificed things in their own way and were very concerned about protecting their homes and their homeland. If you understand Native American thought, the homeland is absolutely crucial. And so as we look back at this time that seems so far away and so long ago, and in some cases so strange, I can see myself. If I were a Navajo person, I would probably be doing the same thing and saying the exact same thing. So it's all part of that human experience that was brought on by World War I. Thank you.
Well, I really appreciate Kerry and Bob and their presentations. About 4 years ago, Bob asked if I would meet with him and Rebecca Rao of the University of Utah Press to talk about a book on World War I. Bob noted that the 100th anniversary was coming up in a few years, and if we got started now, we might be able to pull something together. Bob was the likely person to write or edit the book, and he said, well, I've got 12 other books in the works right now, so maybe you could take it on, which I was happy to do. And thanks to the University of Utah Press then, The book Utah and the Great War, the Beehive State, and the World War I experience has just come out. They put in a Herculean effort to get it out in time for the annual meeting here. And the idea then of having this available for the 100th anniversary on the eve, I think the press deserves great credit for the foresight in pushing it forward. And I think it gives us a great basis for commemorating World War I. The book includes 17 articles. Kerry's on Kanarraville, 2 by Bob on the flu epidemic in southeastern Utah, and another entitled Sailors, Slackers, and Spies, I think, that talks about the community life there. I wish we had been able to get Bob's presentation on the Native Americans of southeastern Utah in this book as well, but maybe that'll be in the next edition. We do have one on the go-shoot resistance to the draft, which is a fascinating article. So if you don't mind a sales pitch, let me just push this one as a book if you're interested in World War I to take a look at. Let me also mention one other thing. Representative Stephen Handy is here, our state representative, who's been pushing for the establishment of a Utah World War I Centennial Commission, and we came within, 30 seconds of getting that established this past legislature, and I believe he'll be pushing that again this year. So we hope to see things like is being done at the Fort Douglas Museum, things at Brigham City, and other lectures and programs and activities to make this a deserving celebration, commemoration of World War I. Well, it was Bob and Kerry that kind of inspired my presentation, in that when I read Kerry's article in the Utah Historical Quarterly 20 years ago, is that how long it's been? I thought, what a fascinating study to be able to look at one community and see how the war affected it. And a few years later, Bob published his article on southeastern Utah that does much of the same. And so my interest was in my home area of Emery and Carbon County, asking the question, what was the war like in these two counties? Was it the same? Were there significant differences? Just what was the experience like? And so the two counties then are very different. One is very rural, Emery County, comprised primarily of the traditional Mormon villages, farmers. Carbon County then has been called Utah's industrialized island because of the railroad that goes through there, as well as the coal mining that takes place there. So you have these two counties that in many ways are very different economically, and yet there's considerable overlap. For example, the farmers in Emery County during the winter, many of them went to the Carbon County coal camps to work in the mines, to earn enough money to support their farms, I guess. Many of the people in Carbon County then had family and association with folks in Emery County as well. So there was this kind of overlap. One other is that Carbon County had been created in 1894. It had been a part of Emery County, which had been founded in 1880. So it was part of the same geographical area. And the other common thread then is both are part of what's called Castle Valley. Still referred to that. Nancy Taniguchi has written a fine book on Utah's Castle Valley, where she does, in much greater historical perspective, a comparison of the region there. So, as I looked at the question, where do I go for information on these counties? Unlike Kerry, who did a significant number of oral history interviews of residents in Kanarraville, maybe we were a little too slow in Carbon and Emery counties to get those people who had actually participated in the war. I remember one of my baseball coaches by the name of Klecker. We just knew him as Klecker. He ran the local pool hall in Huntington. He had been in World War I. But do you think I ever took the time to talk with him and ask him about his experiences? No, it was always baseball that we were talking about. So I really appreciate Kerry's efforts in doing the interviews and then putting this in a fascinating article, and would highly recommend reading that. Okay, well, the source then that I have used for this look at carbon in Emery counties are the 3 newspapers that were published at that time. In Emery County, the Emery County Progress, and in Price, the Sun is the name of the paper, and the News Advocate. Later, those 2 Price papers were combined as the Sun Advocate. But they offer a tremendous amount of coverage of World War I. When I realized that I had 20 minutes to cover the history of World War I in these 2 counties, I got a little panicky. So if you will indulge me, I'd like to read some of this and take it as far until Bob yanks me off the podium here so we can have a period of questions and discussions. Okay, there are 3 or 4 areas that I would like to look at. One is the civilian response to World War I. The second is the nature of the war experience, and this the nature of the war experience comes from the newspaper articles that were published, primarily made up of letters from soldiers expressing their experience, both here in the United States and in Europe as well. And the third area to look at is looking at how, in particular, Carbon County dealt with the issue of nativism and immigration, because there were a large number of immigrants working in the coal mines. The first in the area had been the Italians. There were Finnish miners, Greek miners that had come in, miners from what was called Austria-Hungary, Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic today, Slovakia, the Balkans, Bosnia, these areas. And so you have this rich heritage of ethnicity in Carbon County that plays out in World War I, and so I wanted to look at that. First of all, in terms of production, the local people then were encouraged to establish victory gardens, plant gardens, raise food, so that we don't depend on outside sources. This was no real problem in Emery County. Everyone had gardens there, nothing new. But in Carbon County, that has not necessarily been the case. It had in the agricultural areas, but in the coal camps, for example, no gardens, or very few. And so there was a big push in the coal camps. And at this time, there were, 12, 13, or 14 coal camps in the area. And the miners were encouraged to plant gardens and move forward with that, which they did. Land was provided by the coal companies, and the young people in the communities were encouraged to help these poor miners establish gardens, and they moved forward with that. The farmers were encouraged to produce more, which they did. Everyone was encouraged to consume less, which most of them did, but there was some balking at that. Some people didn't understand why, with all of the livestock around here, we had to go with these meatless days, or who wants to eat oatmeal when we could have wheat cereal, and so forth. So there was a little bit of reluctance there to conform. In terms of coal production, there were about 3,400 miners then in Carbon County during this time, mining in 1917 some 4 million tons of coal, which to that point had been a high in the coal production. There were also another 325 men at Sunnyside who were producing coke from coal to be used in steel manufacturing and so forth. And they produced over 500,000 tons of coke for the war effort. The miners had been paid before the beginning of the war about $3 a day on good days, and quickly the wages jumped up to $4 a day, a 25% increase, which they were very happy to have. The miners' union had been involved in Carbon County in a very hard-fought strike in 1903, 1904. United Mine Workers had come in and attempted to establish a union there, but had been unsuccessful, and the union had left. And now we see a series of strikes breaking out in Castlegate, in Kenilworth, several other coal camps. And the United Mine Workers returns in 1918 in an effort to reestablish the United Mine Workers there. And many of the miners did join and remained members of the union for the duration of the war. And then when another strike broke out in 1922, the union lost, and the union did not return to the county until 1933 in the era of Franklin Roosevelt. Well, how did the local people express their patriotism beyond just consuming more, or producing more and consuming less? There were many outpourings of patriotism, very similar to what Kerry has talked about in Kanarraville, and especially the 4th of July and the sending off of soldiers to fight in the war. Let me read an account of the Farron Soldiers' Day from the Emery County Progress. Thursday, August 29th, 1917 will long stand out in thoughts of our departing soldier boys as a red-letter day not soon to be forgotten, for the people of Farron spared no effort that day in making it a most enjoyable one for the boys from beginning to end. From the parade through the town at noon, through the program in the high school auditorium, the banquet in the social hall, and the dance at the auditorium at night, the boys were feted as only truly honored guests might be. They were also guests with their partner at the moving picture show, and an especially appropriate program was rendered in their honor. The parade, led by the Orangeville Band, formed shortly after noon, with the honored guests astride horses furnished for the occasion and in automobiles, bringing up the rear of a procession over 4 blocks long. The route of the parade included practically every street in the town and brought up at the auditorium shortly after 2 o'clock. So I think the newspaper article presents a very interesting and lively view of how this celebration went forward. There's not time to take a look at all of the soldiers who served, all of the people in the communities, but let me maybe focus on a couple who are who left us accounts in the local newspapers. One of those, Stephen L. Bunnell of Castledale, wrote this from France. He's writing from France. I have seen a good lot of France, and it is a swell country. There are some of the finest looking crops I ever saw in my life. The people here treat us fine, and like I thought we would be. The people have opened their homes to the American soldiers. My section and myself have found rooms in the upstairs of a house, and it seems fine, a real house. They were very pleased when they didn't have to put their 2-man tents together or sleep in the trenches as so many of them did. They say that this village is several hundred years old, and it shows it. I have read of the old villages of the time of Napoleon, never dreaming of seeing them, but I have. Most of the people are very old. They use a donkey and a 2-wheeled cart to haul their crops and harvest them with the old sickle and cradle. They are harvesting their wheat now, and I saw them beating out the wheat on the floor. I am seeing something that I wouldn't take anything for, and will have a great story to tell when I come back. And this seemed to be a motive for many of the soldiers, being able to have some kind of experience that was different, being able to return and tell of their adventures, their experiences. Another man from Price, George Weston Stevenson, writing to his mother, expressed an opinion of maybe what battle was like. Quoting from him, "The main thing is that I am all together and enjoying life, so to speak. That is, I am enjoying it as much as one can who has gone through hell and lost most of his pals. We saw all the mangling and killing we care to for the rest of our lives. The air was just alive with it, and the roar was awful. The sight of the dead and wounded was horrible. It was just hell, that's all. We lost all our blankets, toilet articles, and all such things. All we hung on to was our rifles and trenching tool and emergency rations. That's all we needed. We that got away with our lives thought we were lucky. It seems that there were more wounded than killed. I helped bury one poor fellow at a little after midnight last night." This letter is an awful mess, but maybe you can read it. The Americans sure have those Dutch, German, on the run. Another letter from Guy Thomas, also of Price, to his mother, written on June 22nd, 1918, recounts his battle wounds. "Dear Mother, the reason I have not written before is because I have not been able. I was wounded on June 6th and have been in the hospital since. They shot me through the hips soon after we went into action. I'm getting along fine now and expect to be up and around soon. I have not received mail for 2 months, but I guess that is because I have moved around too much." So this, for someone being shot through the hips, was a pretty upbeat article, or letter, home to his mother. Unfortunately, 3 weeks later, the article in the News Advocate gave us word that Guy Thomas had died because of his wounds. And in response to the death of the first soldier from Carbon County, a massive commemoration was held at one of the theaters in town. Well, I see I only have 2.5 minutes left. 1 minute? 2. Okay. I'm going to have to pick a quote here. What was the response then to all of these immigrants in the county? Many Carbon County citizens, from the News Advocate, are surprised at the large number of exemption claims filed by the boys who were drafted. It is too bad that most of the aliens were not willing to go, and it does not seem fair that war must be fought, sacrifices must be made, and some lives must be lost. What you have here going on in Carbon County is kind of a paradox. You have criticism of the immigrants, and I've got another session here to read from the paper about those, but you also have a push for those aliens, those immigrants, those foreign-born, to become true Americans, to join, to buy war bonds, to fight, and everything else. So one other quote here. The questionnaire now being filled out by the young men of draft age do not disclose that the boys of foreign birth are any more ready to go than they were when first examined. Neither do they wish to be sent back to help their brothers who are fighting in their native lands. Of course, there are some of both Greeks and Italians who are ready to fight, either with the American army or to be sent back to fight wherever needed, but they are in the minority. The majority claim exemption on account of their alienship, and when they come to the question as to whether they are willing to go back to their native land to fight with their brothers, they answer no. Feeding against such, and this is typical of the time, feeding against such dirty, low-down grafters is running high in many towns in Utah, and many letters are being sent to our representatives in Congress asking speed in legislation which will compel these fellows to either come in or get out. Fathers and mothers who are sending their American-born boys to fight in Italy, if need be, and for the safety of both Greeks and Italians and all other races, are getting more and more incensed at the whelps who think of nothing but getting American dollars under the American flag but who would not turn a hand over to save the flag from being dragged in the dirt by the Kaiser's bloody cutthroats. And then this threat: some of the worst specimens of this sort are going to get some early day Western treatment if they do not wake up to their duty soon. Well, it's pretty clear where the News Advocate stood on this, and yet in the same papers, the same issue, there was an article from a Greek resident who explained why the Greeks weren't fighting. They felt the Germans, the British, were just out to get Greek land, and they were not willing to support that kind of effort. The papers also indicate, for example, the Sunnyside Italian Band went around to various parades and celebrations for playing patriotic airs, and so that was a positive plus. And finally, the coal camps. In the coal camps, the Greek and Italian, Slovenian miners were identified as doing more than their share in contributing. Letters were submitted to the paper from a Greek-American soldier, T.H. Juflis, and Henry Ruggieri, an Italian-American officer. Those were printed. So as I say, you have this interesting paradox between making sure that these people who were not born in the United States did their share, and threatening them to some extent, but encouraging them to and recognize them on occasions when they did participate. Well, as you can see, I've just scratched the surface of what was going on in Carbon and Emery County. It's a fascinating story, and I think each community in the state has its own story to be told, and I hope that that's something that can be done during this centennial of World War I. Thank you.
Take the mic. One quick sidebar. Kerry mentioned, I'm sorry, the 40 and 8 rail cars. Actually, 40 soldiers or 8 horses. After the war, the French government put together one for every state of the Union and loaded them up with souvenirs from the battlefield and sent one to each state. The one that came into Utah, Governor Mabee handed out all those souvenirs to his buddies. So what we have left out of that whole rail car is we have one machine gun that's at the Fort Douglas Museum, and the rail car itself has been restored and is at the Rio Grande Train Museum up at Ogden. So if you ever want to see that and what a real 40 and 8 looks like, get up there sometime for that. So let's now turn it over to questions and answers. So go ahead. Anybody got questions? We could have let you.
Ron's got one.
Oh, okay.
There are a number of mines beginning about 1914 on, all the way up to Spring Canyon. Do you think those mines started because of World War I, the war in Europe? I'm not talking about the war in the United States right now, but the war in Europe. Did that begin those mines?
Yeah, during Ron's asking the question about the expansion of the coal mining in Carbon County, and there was a tremendous expansion beginning about 1914. And was that in response to World War I? I think very much so. Camps at Utes and Hiawatha come into being at that time, and it's and in Spring Canyon as well. And I think just the demand for coal was the primary factor for that, and that demand came because of World War I.
There's back here, behind you first. Go ahead.
I have a question for Dr. McPherson. Are there eyewitness accounts from Navajo soldiers in World War I of what they experienced or what their impressions were? It sounds like it would have been such a different world for them.
Yeah, no, like I say, the participation was really, really low in terms of actually getting in to the Army, military, and going. I'm not aware of anything. That doesn't mean that it didn't happen, but I'm not aware of anything. And so, yeah.
Okay. Next one's up here. Go ahead.
It just seemed to be like the
Navajos, the Greeks, the Italians were treated terribly. In fact, if you was a Greek or an Italian and went into the price, you got thrown out or thrown in jail.
That's right. Fort Douglas was one of the 3 camps where they did that with so-called enemy aliens,
Yeah.
or communists, or wobblies, or socialists, or strike breakers, or union organizers. That's all it took to get thrown in
Anybody
jail.
that wasn't a Mormon had got thrown in jail.
Yep. Yep. It's true.
It's kind of a wonder that they
No due process either.
even went to fight for the country. Now, I know this, that if you actually was a minority and went to report for work, they'd give all the white people a job, and then if there was anything left over, maybe an Italian or maybe a Greek would get it.
Maybe Ken made the mistake of giving this to me, so I'm just going to talk.
You got 2 minutes, Bob, then pass it over.
Okay. All right. Just a couple of points. First of all, Native Americans who served in World War I were granted citizenship in 1919 as part of their thank you for those who participated. All Native Americans became citizens in 1924. And so, and it was in part because of the involvement in World War I. The other thing that I wanted to mention, and this goes back to the woman who asked the question about Navajo involvement. Like I say, nil as far as I'm aware. But one thing that is interesting is that the Navajo code talkers that are so prominent in World War II and everything, there were actually, if I remember correctly, and I'm not sure, but I think it was like 19 different tribes during World War I that did an ad hoc code talker type situation. So you've got, a half a dozen Pawnee over here. Well, you put one Pawnee here and another one in the field over here in this headquarters and so forth. So there were some interesting contributions that were made in the field across the pond during World War I by Native Americans, but not in terms of the Navajo. That will be World War II. So go ahead.
Go ahead.
That whole story of the ethnic experience in Carbon County is a fascinating one, and Ron Wadden, who wrote the history of Carbon County for the state's Centennial History series, has dealt with that. Others have, and it is a fascinating story, and the oral histories we've done, I think, substantiate in many ways what you've said about the discrimination and the difficulty in doing that.
So I know in Louisiana there were people or men that were drafted specifically for their experience in the timber industry, so that they could be used overseas. In the mining industry here, was there any kind of result or need for that kind of a draft?
No, because they were able to get miners locally, but they also brought in miners from outside of the state. A number of Hispanics from Colorado were brought in, and different locations. But as near as I can tell, unlike World War II, where miners were given an exemption to stay and work in the coal mines, during World War I, if they were registered for the draft and drafted, then they were expected to go.
Yeah, just a question or a comment on mining, and then a question for Ken. I know that this potash mine out here at the Bonneville Salt Flats out by Wendover that's caused a lot of problems with the salt flats. That was started in the World War I era for fertilizer, of course. But anyway, a comment to you, Kent. You wrote this excellent article. You sent me a copy of it in the quarterly about the Utah Defense Councils. Were they just as active in the rural counties as they would have been in the urban counties here? The Utah Defense Council organizations.
Yes, this was part of the national war effort to establish in each state a council of defense, state council of defense. So Governor Bamberger appointed statewide And under that, then, in all except one county, Daggett County, there were county councils of defense. And in Carbon and in Emery, they were both very active in kind of coordinating the fund drive, Liberty loans, and commemorations and so forth. And so, yeah, that's a very interesting part of the story, as well as how the communities were organized and came to fight the effort here.
Thank you.
Question for Kerry. What were the circumstances of these men from Kanarraville fighting against the Bolsheviks? Can you talk a little bit about that?
I'm only aware of Leon Davis fighting the Bolsheviks. I haven't really studied the background of the expeditionary force into Russia, but he was there till the end of 1919.
We sent forces to support the White Russians to Vladivostok, and then also to, what's the one on the Pacific coast? Where Port Arthur is. But on both sides, we allied with the Japanese on the one on the Pacific, and we were fighting with the French and the British to assist the White Russians against the Red Russians, which is one of the reasons that for so many years the Russian communist government was paranoid about our intervention, because we actually tried to interfere with that. It's one of those campaigns for the U.S. Army that's not well publicized. Chuck probably is aware of it, but we sent about a division-sized force to assist the Allies to put down the Red Russians. And that was right at the end of World War I, and went into like 1919. And that's probably the expedition that this soldier was on.
Right.
Even then we thought it was the Red Peril.
Yeah.
Even back in 1919, 1918. Okay, well, lunch is at any time now. You should have a lunch ticket when you signed up.
Ron had a question.
Oh, another question. We got time. Sure.
The other part of that, the war effort was attraction. For example, the earliest church, Tabernacle in Twice, was started 1912 or something like that, and they were really slow at building it. They didn't finish it. They moved into the basement, but they didn't finish it until the early 1920s. And Twice, by that time, they finished the Twice was $100,000. That's just inflated price because of the war.
I need to correct my previous statements. Murmansk was the one that was in the east, or in the west, and Vladivostok was the one in the Pacific. Yeah, I made a mistake there. Those were two.
Ron raises, I think, another important aspect of the whole war effort, and that's the involvement of the churches. And the LDS Church in particular was very anxious to demonstrate its patriotism. They subscribed to war bonds, encouraged young men to go off and fight, and this is talked about in the book here a little bit, that this was an opportunity after all those years of conflict with the United States to finally demonstrate that the Utahns were 100% American, and that's something we haven't touched on too much today, but another one of those fascinating aspects of World War I.